All right, what's up, everybody out there in Twitch and YouTube land? Welcome in. We're going to be reading some Charles Dickens today. We're going to continue on with our Great Expectations read. We are on chapter 35, as you can see from your screen. If you are on TikTok and you want to if you want to read along with me, you can find the read along at the Boston Chris Show, all one word, on Twitch or YouTube. We are live right now on both. For those of you who might be here from the last time we read, we just learned that Pip's sister has passed away. And so he's going to be traveling to go to her funeral, and that's where we are at in the story. So I'm going to go ahead and test the sound and make sure it sounds okay. That's the first step. Chapter 35. It was the first time that a grave had opened in my road of life. And then we're going to listen to that back. Chapter 35. It was the first time that a grave had opened in my road of life. All right, perfect. Sound check is okay. For those of you who may be wondering, who have not followed along with my read, not only am I reading this book live for 3 platforms, TikTok, YouTube, and Twitch, but I am also editing the live reading into an audiobook for my Twitch, for my YouTube channel as well. So that's why we are doing this. Audiobooks is something I do on my YouTube. But yeah, so here we go. We're going to go to chapter 35. We're going to get this started. We'll probably do a few chapters at least today. I hope you guys enjoy. Interruptions are welcome. And here we go. Chapter 35. It was the first time that a grave had opened in my road of life, and the gap it made in the smooth ground was wonderful. The figure of my sister in her chair by the kitchen fire haunted me night and day. That the place could possibly be, without her, was something my mind seemed unable to compass. Interesting. I have not heard that word. Compass. Let me see something. Contrive to accomplish. All right. Was something my mind seemed unable to compass. And whereas she had seldom or never been in my thoughts of late, I had now the strangest ideas that she was coming towards me in the street, or that she would presently knock at the door. In my rooms, too, with which she had never been at all associated, there was at once the blankness of death, and a perpetual suggestion of the sound of her voice, or the turn of her face or figure, as if she was still alive and had been often there. Whatever my fortunes might have been, I could scarcely have recalled my sister with much tenderness. But I suppose there is a shock of regret which may exist without much tenderness. Under its influence, and perhaps to make up for the want of the softer feeling, I was seized with a violent indignation against the assailant from whom she had suffered so much. And I felt that on sufficient proof I could have revengefully pursued Orlick, or anyone else, to the last extremity, having written to Joe to offer him consolation and to assure him that I would come to the funeral. I passed the intermediate days in the curious state of mind I have glanced at. I went down early in the morning and alighted at the Blue Boar in good time to walk over to the forge. It was fine summer weather again, and as I walked along, the times when I was a little helpless creature, and my sister did not spare me, vividly returned. But they returned with a gentle tone upon them that softened even the edge of tickler. For now, the very breath of the beans and clover whispered to my heart that the day must come when it would be well for my memory that others walking in the sunshine should be softened as they thought of me. At last, I came within sight of the house and saw that Trabb and Company had put in a funereal execution and taken possession. Two dismally absurd persons, each ostentatiously exhibiting a crutch done up in a black bandage, as if that instrument could possibly communicate any comfort to anybody, were posted at the front door, and in one of them I recognized a postboy discharged from the Boar for turning a young couple into a saw-pit on their bridal morning, in consequence of intoxication rendering it necessary for him to ride his horse clasped round the neck with both arms. All the children of the village, and most of the women, were admiring these sable warders and the closed windows of the house and forge, and as I came up, one of the two warders, the postboy, knocked at the door, implying that I was far too much exhausted by grief to have strength remaining to knock for myself. Another sable warder, a carpenter who had once eaten 2 geese for a wager, opened the door and showed me into the best parlor. Here, Mr. Trabb had taken unto himself the best table and had got all the leaves up and was holding a kind of black bazaar with the aid of a quantity of black pins. At the moment of my arrival, he had just finished putting somebody's hat into black long clothes like an African baby, so he held out his hand for mine. But I, misled by the action and confused by the occasion, shook hands with him with every testimony of warm affection. Poor dear Joe, entangled in a little black cloak, tied in a large bow under his chin, was seated apart at the upper end of the room, where, as chief mourner, he had evidently been stationed by Trabb. When I bent down and said to him, "Dear Joe, how are you?" he said, "Pip, old chap, you knowed her when she was a fine figure of a—" and clasped my hand and said no more. Biddy, looking very neat and modest in her black dress, went quietly here and there and was very helpful. When I had spoken to Biddy, as I thought it not a time for talking, I went and sat down near Joe, and there began to wonder in what part of the house she, my sister, was. The air of the parlor being faint with the smell of sweet cake, I looked about for the table of refreshments. It was scarcely visible until one had got accustomed to the gloom, but there was a cut-up plum cake upon it, and there were cut-up oranges and sandwiches and biscuits, and 2 decanters that I knew very well as ornaments, but had never seen used in all of my life, one full of port and one full of sherry. Is it sherry or sherry? I think it's sherry. Just want to make sure. All right. Sherry.
Sherry.
It's sherry, okay. Standing at this table, I became conscious of the servile Pumblechook in a black cloak and several yards of hat band, who was alternately stuffing himself and making obsequious movements to catch my attention. The moment he succeeded, he came over to me, breathing sherry and crumbs, and said in a subdued voice, "May I, dear sir?" and did. I then descried, is it decried? Have I been saying that wrong all the time? God dang it. No.
Described.
Okay. I've been saying it fine. right. I then described Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, the last named in a decent speechless paroxysm in a corner. We were all going to follow, and were all in course of being tied up separately, by Trabb, into ridiculous bundles. "Which I meant to say, Pip," Joe whispered me. I'm going to say that again. "Which I meant to say, Pip," Joe whispered me, as we were being what Mr. Trabb called formed in the parlor, 2 and 2, and it was dreadfully like a preparation for some grim kind of dance. "Which I meant to say, sir, as I would in preference have carried her to church. As I would in preference have carried her to the church myself, along with 3 or 4 friendly ones what come to it with willing hearts and arms. But it were considered what the neighbors would look down on such, and would be of opinions as it were wanting in respect." "Pocket handkerchiefs out, all!" cried Mr. Trabb at this point, in a depressed, business-like voice. "Pocket handkerchiefs out! We are ready." So, we all put our pocket handkerchiefs to our faces, as if our noses were bleeding, and filed out, 2 by 2, Joe and I, Biddy and Pumblechook, Mr. and Mrs. Hubble. The remains of my poor sister had been brought round by the kitchen door, and, it being a point of undertaking ceremony that the 6 bearers must be stifled and blinded under a horrible black velvet housing with a white border, the whole looked like a blind monster with 12 human legs, shuffling and blundering along under the guidance of 2 keepers, the postboy and his comrade. The neighborhood, however, there was my accent. The neighborhood, however, highly approved of these arrangements, and we were much admired as we went through the village, the more youthful and vigorous part of the community making dashes now and then to cut us off, and lying in wait to intercept us at points of vantage. At such times the more exuberant among them called out in an excited manner on our emergence round some corner of expectancy. "Here they come! Here they are!" And we were all but cheered. In this progress I was much annoyed by the abject Pumblechook, who, being behind me, persisted all the way as a delicate attention in arranging my streaming hatband and smoothing my cloak. My thoughts were further distracted by the excessive pride of Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, who were surpassingly conceited and vainglorious in being members of so distinguished a procession. And now the range of marshes lay clear before us, with the sails of the ships on the river growing out of it, and we went into the churchyard, close to the graves of my unknown parents, Philip Purrup, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above. And there my sister was laid quietly in the earth, while the larks sang high above it, and the light wind strewed it with beautiful shadows of clouds and trees. Of the conduct of the worldly-minded Pumblechook while this was doing, I desire to say no more than it was all addressed to me, and that even when those noble passages were read which remind humanity how it brought nothing into the world and can take nothing out, and how it fleeth like a shadow and never continueth long in one stay, I heard him cough a reservation of the case of a young gentleman who came unexpectedly into large property. When we got back, he had the hardihood to tell me that he wished my sister could have known I had done her so much honor, and to hint that she would have considered it reasonably purchased at the price of her death. After that, he drank all the rest of the sherry, and Mr. Hubble drank the port, and the 2 talked, which I have since observed to be customary in such cases, as if they were of quite another race from the deceased, and were notoriously immortal. Finally, he went away with Mr. and Mrs. Hubble to make an evening of it, I felt sure, and to tell the jolly bargeman that he was the founder of my fortunes and my earliest benefactor. When they were all gone, and when Trabb and his men, but not his boy, I looked for him, had crammed their mummery into bags, and were gone too, the house felt wholesomer. Soon afterwards, Biddy, Joe, and I had a cold dinner together, but we dined in the best parlor, not in the old kitchen, and Joe was so exceedingly particular what he did with his knife and fork, and the salt cellar and what not, that there was great restraint upon us. But after dinner, when I made him take his pipe, and when I had loitered with him about the forge, and when we sat down together on the great block of stone outside it, we got on better. I noticed that after the funeral Joe changed his clothes. One more time. I noticed that after the funeral Joe changed his clothes so far as to make a compromise between his Sunday dress and his working dress, in which the dear fellow looked natural and like the man he was. He was very much pleased by my asking if I might sleep in my own little room, and I was pleased too, for I felt that I had done rather a great thing in making the request. When the shadows of evening were closing in, I took an opportunity of getting into the garden with Biddy for a little talk. "Biddy," said I think you might have written to me about these sad matters." "Do you, Mr. Pip?" said Biddy. "I should have written if I had thought that." "Don't suppose that I mean to be unkind, Biddy, when I say I consider that you ought to have thought that." "Do you, Mr. Pip?" She was so quiet, and had such an orderly, good, and pretty way with her, that I did not like the thought of making her cry again. After looking a little at her downcast eyes as she walked beside me, I gave up that point. "I suppose it will be difficult for you to remain here now, Biddy dear?" "Oh, I can't do so, Mr. Pip," said Biddy, in a tone of regret but still of quiet conviction. "I have been speaking to Mrs. Hubble, and I am going to her tomorrow. I hope we shall be able to take care of I hope we shall be able to take some care of Mr. Gargery together until he settles down. How are you going to live, Biddy? If you want any How am I going to live?" repeated Biddy, striking in, with a momentary flush upon her face. "I'll tell you, Mr. Pip. I am going to try to get the place of mistress in the new school nearly finished here. I can be well recommended by all the neighbors, and I hope I can be industrious and patient, and teach myself while I teach others. You know, Mr. Pip," pursued Biddy, with a smile, as she raised her eyes to my face, "the new schools are not like the old, but I learnt a good deal from you after that time, and have had time since then to improve. I think you would always improve, Biddy, under any circumstances." "Ah, except in my bad side of human nature," murmured Biddy. It was not so much a reproach as an irresistible thinking aloud. Well, I thought I would give up that point, too, so I walked a little further with Biddy, looking silently at her downcast eyes. "I have not heard the particulars of my sister's death, Biddy." "They are very slight, poor thing. She had been in one of her bad states, though they had got better of late, rather than worse, for 4 days, when she came out of it in the evening, just at tea time, and said quite plainly, 'Joe?' As she had never said any word for a long while, I ran and fetched Mr. Gargery from the forge. She made signs to me that she wanted him to sit down close to her, and wanted me to put her arms round his neck. So I put them round his neck, and she laid her head down on his shoulder quite content and satisfied. And so she presently said 'Joe' again, and once 'Pardon,' and once 'Pip.' And so she never lifted her head up any more, and it was just an hour later when we laid it down on her own bed, because we found she was gone." Biddy cried. The darkening garden and the lane and the stars that were coming out were blurred in my own sight. Nothing was ever discovered, Biddy? Nothing. Do you know what has become of Orlick? I should think from the color of his clothes that he is working in the quarries. Of course you have seen him, then? Why are you looking at that dark tree in the lane? I saw him there, on the night she died. That was not the last time either, Biddy. One more time. That was not the last time either, Biddy. No, I have seen him there, since we have been walking here. It is of no use, said Biddy. Card just went by. Give me a second. Hello, ICVR. Welcome to the channel. Good to see you. Sorry I missed your comment. Hope you're still there. It is of no use, said Biddy, laying her hand upon my arm as I was for running out. You know I would not deceive you. He was not there a minute, and he is gone. It revived my utmost. So this is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. We are on chapter 35. It revived my utmost indignation to find that she was still pursued by this fellow, and I felt inveterate against him. I told her so, and told her that I would spend any money or take any pains to drive him out of that country. By degrees she led me into more temperate talk, and she told me how Joe loved me, and how Joe never complained of anything. She didn't say of me she had no need. I knew what she meant, but ever did his duty in his way of life, with a strong hand, a quiet tongue, and a gentle heart. Indeed, hold on, this is me. Indeed, it would be hard to say too much for him, said Biddy, said I. And Biddy, we must often speak of these things, for of course I shall be often down here now. I am not going to leave poor Joe alone. Biddy said never a single word. Biddy, don't you hear me? Yes, Mr. Pip. Not to mention your calling me Mr. Pip, which appears to me to be in bad taste, Biddy. What do you mean? What do I mean? Asked Biddy timidly. Biddy, said I, in a virtuously, said I, in a virtuously self-asserting manner, I must request to know what you mean by this. By this? Said Biddy. Now don't echo, I retorted. You used not to echo, Biddy. Used not? Said Biddy. Oh, Mr. Pip, used? Well, I rather thought I would give up that point, too. After another silent turn in the garden, I fell back on the main position. Biddy. All right, I'm subbing, but I have to leave. Love your content and see you later. Yo, Icy, I appreciate the compliment, man. Thank you for the sub. You have a great rest of your Tuesday evening. All right. Biddy, said I made a remark respecting my coming down here often to see Joe, which you received with a marked silence. Have the goodness, Biddy, to tell me why. Are you quite sure, then, that you will come to see him often? Asked Biddy, stopping in the narrow garden walk and looking at me under the stars with a clear and honest eye. Oh, dear me, said I, as if I found myself compelled to give up Biddy in despair. This really is a very bad side of human nature. Don't say any more, if you please, Biddy. This shocks me very, very much. For which cogent reason? It could be cogent. It probably is, actually. Cogent.
Cogent.
Cogent. For which cogent reason I kept Biddy at a distance during supper, and when I went up to my own old little room, took as stately a leave of her as I could, in my murmuring soul, deem reconcilable with the churchyard in the event of the day, as often as I was restless in the night, and that was every quarter of an hour, I reflected what an unkindness, what an injury, what an injustice Biddy had done me. Another car just went by. Early in the morning I was to go. Early in the morning I was out, and looking in, unseen, at one of the wooden windows of the forge. There I stood for minutes, looking at Joe, already at work with a glow of health and strength upon his face that made it show as if the bright sun of the life in store for him were shining on it. "Goodbye, dear Joe. No, don't wipe it off. For God's sake, give me your blackened hand. I shall be down soon, and often." "Never too soon, sir," said Joe, "and never too often, Pip." Biddy was waiting for me at the kitchen door, with a mug of new milk and a crust of bread. "Biddy," said I, when I gave her my hand at parting, "I am not angry, but I am hurt." "No, don't be hurt," she pleaded quite pathetically. "Let only me be hurt, if I have been ungenerous." Once more the mists were rising as I walked away. If they disclosed to me, as I suspect they did, that I should not come back, and that Biddy was quite right, all I can say is, they were quite right too. I am saddened by, I don't know, man. I'm saddened by the change in Pip, right? And it's getting worse all the time. So it's not going to get better, I don't think, right? I don't think it's getting better. It's just... like, he's trying to love Joe, but, like, he's... Joe is like a growth, right? Like, he's just a growth. Like, how can you love a growth, right? Yeah, sure, it's part of you, but, like, you'd rather not show anybody it exists, and that's Joe to Pip, and that's sad, man. It really is. Okay, on to the next. Chapter 36. Herbert and I went on from bad to worse in the way of increasing our debts, looking into our affairs, leaving margins, and the like exemplary transactions, and time went on, whether or no, as he has a way of doing, and I came of age, in fulfillment of Herbert's prediction, that I should do so before I knew where I was. Herbert himself had come of age 8 months before me. As he had nothing else than his majority to come into, the event did not make a profound sensation at Bernard's Inn, but we had looked forward to my 21st birthday with a crowd of speculations and anticipations, for we had both considered that my guardian could hardly help saying something definite on that occasion. I had taken care to have it well understood in Little Britain when my birthday was. On the day before it, I received an official note from Wemmick, informing me that Mr. Jaggers would be glad if I would call upon him at 5 in the afternoon of the auspicious day. This convinced us that something great was going to happen. That's not what it says there. This convinced us that something great was to happen, and threw me into an unusual flutter when I repaired to my guardian's office, a model of punctuality. In the outer office, Wemmick offered me his congratulations, and incidentally rubbed the side of his nose with a folded piece of tissue paper that I liked the look of. But he said nothing respecting it, and motioned me with a nod into my guardian's room. It was November, and my guardian was standing before his fire, leaning his back against the chimney-piece, with his hands under his coat-tails. "Well, Pip," said he, "I must call you Mr. Pip today. Congratulations, Mr. Pip." We shook hands. He was always a remarkably short shaker, and I thanked him. "Take a chair, Mr. Pip," said my guardian. As I sat down and he preserved his attitude and bent his brows at his boots, I felt at a disadvantage, which reminded me of that old time when I had been put upon a tombstone. The two ghastly casts on the shelf were not far from him, and their expression was as if they were making a stupid apoplectic. Apoplectic. I'm going to make sure that's correct. I think it's apoplectic.
Apoplectic.
Mm-hmm. And their expression was as if they were making a stupid apoplectic attempt to attend to the conversation. "Now, my young friend," my guardian began, as if I were a witness in the box, "I am going to have a word or two with you." "If you please, sir." "What do you suppose?" said Mr. Jaggers, bending forward to look at the ground and then throwing his head back to look at the ceiling. "What do you suppose you are living at the rate of?" "At the rate of, sir?" "At," repeated Mr. Jaggers, still looking at the ceiling. "The rate of," and then looked all round the room and paused with his pocket handkerchief in his hand, halfway to his nose. I had looked into my affairs so often that I had thoroughly destroyed any slight notion I might ever have had of their bearings. Reluctantly, I confessed myself quite unable to answer the question. This reply seemed agreeable to Mr. Jaggers, who said, "I thought so," and blew his nose with an air of satisfaction. "Now, I have asked you a question, my friend," said Mr. Jaggers. "Have you anything to ask me?" "Of course it would be a great relief to me to ask you several questions, sir, but I remember your prohibition." "Ask one," said Mr. Jaggers. "Is my benefactor to be made known to me today?" "No." "Ask another." "Is that confidence to be imparted to me soon?" "Waive that a moment," said Mr. Jaggers, "and ask another." I looked about me, but there appeared to be now no possible escape from the inquiry. "Have I anything to receive, sir?" On that, Mr. Jaggers said triumphantly, "I thought we should come to it," and called to Wemmick to give him that piece of paper. Wemmick appeared, handed it in, and disappeared. "Now, Mr. Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, "attend, if you please. You have been drawing pretty freely here. Your name occurs pretty often in Wemmick's cash book, but you are in debt, of course." "I am afraid I must say yes, sir." "You know you must say yes, don't you?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Yes, sir." "I don't ask you what you owe, because you don't know, and if you did know, you wouldn't tell me. You would say less. Yes, yes, my friend," cried Mr. Jaggers, waving his forefinger to stop me as I made a show of protesting. "It's likely enough that you think you wouldn't, but you would. You'll excuse me, but I know better than you. Now, take this piece of paper in your hand. You have got it? Very good. Now, unfold it and tell me what it is." "This is a banknote," said I, "for £500. "That is a banknote," repeated Mr. Jaggers, "for £500, and a very handsome sum of money, too, I think. You consider it so?" "How could I do otherwise?" "Ah, but answer the question," said Mr. Jaggers. "Undoubtedly." "You consider it undoubtedly a handsome sum of money. Now, that handsome sum of money, Pip, is your own. It is a present to you on this day, in earnest of your expectations, and at the rate of that handsome sum of money per annum, and at no higher rate, you are to live until the donor of the whole appears. That is to say, you will now take your money affairs entirely into your own hands, and you will draw from Wemmick £125 per quarter until you are in communication with the fountainhead and no longer with the mere agent. As I have told you before, I am the mere agent. I execute my instructions, and I am paid for doing so. I think them injudicious, but I am not paid for giving any opinion on their merits. I was beginning to express my gratitude to my benefactor for the great liberality with which I was treated, when Mr. Jaggers stopped me. I am not paid, Pip, said he, coolly, to carry your words to anyone, and then gathered up his coat-tails, as he had gathered up the subject, and stood frowning at his boots as if he suspected them of designs against him. After a pause, I hinted, "There was a question just now, Mr. Jaggers." There's a car outside, or I think it's an airplane, actually. Yeah, it's an airplane. So I am going to make a drink. How is everybody doing tonight, y'all? Hope everybody's doing okay. Which you desired me to waive for a moment. I hope I am doing nothing wrong in asking it again. What is it? Said he. I might have known that he would never help me out, but it took me aback to have to shape the question afresh, as if it were quite new. Is it likely, I said, after hesitating, that my patron, the fountainhead you have spoken of, Mr. Jaggers, will soon— There I delicately stopped. Will soon what? Asked Mr. Jaggers. That's no question as it stands, you know. Will soon come to London, said I, after casting about for a precise form of words, or summon me anywhere else? Now here, replied Mr. Jaggers, fixing me for the first time with his dark, deep-set eyes. We must revert to the evening when we first encountered one another in your village. What did I tell you then, Mr. Pip? You told me, Mr. Jaggers, that it might be years hence when that person appeared. Just so, said Mr. Jaggers. That's my answer. As we looked full at one another, I felt my breath come quicker in my strong desire to get something out of him. And as I felt that it came quicker, and as I felt that he saw that it came quicker, I felt that I had less chance than ever of getting anything out of him. Do you suppose it will still be years hence, Mr. Jaggers? Mr. Jaggers shook his head, not in negativing the question, but in altogether negativing the notion that he could anyhow be got to answer it. And the two horrible casts of the twitched faces looked, when my eyes strayed up to them, as if they had come to a crisis in their suspended attention and were going to sneeze. Come, said Mr. Jaggers, warming the backs of his legs with the backs of his warmed hands. I'll be plain with you, my friend Pip. That's a question I must not be asked. You'll understand that better when I tell you it's a question that might compromise me. Come, I'll go a little further with you. I'll say something more. He bent down so low to frown at his boots that he was able to rub the calves of his legs in the pause he made. When that person discloses, said Mr. Jaggers, straightening himself, you and that person will settle your own affairs. When that person discloses, my part in this business will cease and determine. When that person discloses, it will not be necessary for me to know anything about it, and that's all I have got to say. We looked at one another until I withdrew my eyes, and looked thoughtfully at the door. From this last speech I derived the notion that Miss Havisham, for some reason or no reason, had not taken him into her confidence after her designing me for Estella. That he resented this, and felt a jealousy about it, or that he really did object to that scheme, and would have nothing to do with it. When I raised my eyes again, I found that he had been shrewdly looking at me all the time, and was doing so still. "If that is all you have to say, sir," I remarked, "there can be nothing left for me to say." He nodded assent, and pulled out his thief-dreaded watch, and asked me where I was going to dine. I replied at my own chambers with Herbert. As a necessary sequence, I asked him if he would favor us with his company, and he promptly accepted the invitation. But he insisted on walking home with me in order that I might make no extra preparation for him. And first he had a letter or two to write, and, of course, had his hands to wash. So I said I would go into the outer office and talk to Wemmick. The fact was that when the £500 had come into my pocket, a thought had come into my head which had been often there before, and it appeared to me that Wemmick was a good person to advise with concerning such thought. He had already locked up his safe, and made preparations for going home. He had left his desk, brought out his 2 greasy office candlesticks, and stood them in line with the snuffers on a slab near the door, ready to be extinguished. He had raked his fire low, put his hat and greatcoat ready, and was beating himself all over the chest with his safe key as an athletic exercise. No, that's an athletic. That's tough. As an athletic exercise after business. "Mr. Wemmick," said I want to ask your opinion. I am very desirous to serve a friend." Wemmick tightened his post office and shook his head, as if his opinion were dead against any fatal weakness of that sort. "This friend," nope, this is me. This friend, I pursued, "is trying to get on in commercial life, but has no money, and finds it difficult and disheartening to make a beginning. Now I want somehow to help him to a beginning." "With money down?" said Wemmick in a tone drier than any sawdust. "With some money down," I replied, for an uneasy remembrance shot across me of that symmetrical bundle of papers at home. "With some money down, and perhaps some anticipation of my expectations." "Mr. Pip," said Wemmick, "I should like just to run over with you on my fingers, if you please, the names of the various bridges up as high as Chelsea Reach. Let's see. There's London, 1. Southwark, 2. Blackfriars, 3. Waterloo is 4. Westminster, 5. Vauxhall, 6. He had checked off each bridge in its turn, with the handle of his safe key on the palm of his hand. "There's as many as 6, you see, to choose from." "I don't understand you," said I. "Choose your bridge, Mr. Pip," returned Wemmick, "and take a walk upon your bridge, and pitch your money into the Thames over the center arch of your bridge, and you know the end of it. Serve a friend with it, and you may know the end of it too, but it's a less pleasant and profitable end." I could have posted a newspaper in his mouth, he made it so wide after saying this. "This is very discouraging," said I. "Meant to be so," said Wemmick. "Then, is it your opinion," I inquired, with some little indignation, "that a man should never—" "Invest portable property in a friend?" said Wemmick. "Certainly he should not, unless he wants to get rid of the friend, and then it becomes a question how much portable property it may be worth to get rid of him." "And that," said I, "is your deliberate opinion, Mr. Wemmick? That, he returned, is my deliberate opinion in this office. Ah, said I, pressing him, for I thought I saw him near a loophole here. Another car. But would that be your opinion at Walworth? Mr. Pip, he replied with gravity, Walworth is one place, and this office is another, much as the aged is one person, and Mr. Jaggers is another. They must not be confounded together. My Walworth sentiments must be taken at Walworth. None but my official sentiments can be taken in this office. Very well, said I, much relieved. Then I shall look you up at Walworth. You may depend upon it. Mr. Pip, he returned, you will be welcome there in a private and personal capacity. We had held this conversation in a low voice, well knowing my guardian's ears to be the sharpest of the sharp. As he now appeared in his doorway, toweling his hands, Wemmick got on his great coat and stood by to snuff out the candles. We all three went into the street together, and from the doorstep Wemmick turned his way, and Mr. Jaggers and I turned ours. I could not help wishing more than once that evening that Mr. Jaggers had had an aged in Gerrard Street, or a stinger, or a something, or a somebody, to unbend his brows a little. It was an uncomfortable consideration on a 21st birthday that coming of age at all seemed hardly worthwhile in such a guarded and suspicious world as he made of it. He was 1,000 times better informed and cleverer than Wemmick, and yet I would 1,000 times rather have had Wemmick to dinner. And Mr. Jaggers made not me alone intensely melancholy, because, after he was gone, Herbert said of himself, with his eyes fixed on the fire, that he thought he must have committed a felony and forgotten the details of it. He felt so dejected and guilty. Chapter 36, Finito. Let's go. All right, I'm just going to listen to a little bit of this to make sure it sounds okay still. Mr. Jaggers, fixing me for the first time with his dark, deep-set eyes. We must revert to the evening when we first encountered one another in your village. What did I tell you then, Mr. Pip? You told me. Sounds fine. All right. Chapter 37. I assume this is going to be a conversation at Walworth with Mr. Wemmick. Probably about... What's up, Jess? Welcome in. Probably about loaning money to Herbert. That's what this is about. He wants to help Herbert get off to a good beginning on his life as well, because they have both recently come of age. And it just feels unfair to Pip that Herbert, a guy that he used to fight with, deserves more apparently than Joe, right? Interesting. So, we're going to go ahead and continue on with the story. It is chapter 37 up next. Here we go. Chapter 37. Deeming Sunday the best day for taking Mr. Wemmick's Walworth sentiments, I devoted the next ensuing Sunday afternoon to a pilgrimage to the castle. On arriving before the battlements, I found the Union Jack flying and the drawbridge up, but undeterred by this show of defiance and resistance, I rang at the gate and was admitted in a most pacific manner by the aged. "My son, sir," said the old man after securing the drawbridge, "rather had it in his mind that you might happen to drop in, and he left word that he would soon be home from his afternoon's walk. He is very regular in his walks, is my son. Very regular in everything, is my son." I nodded at the old gentleman as Wemmick himself might have nodded, and we went in and sat down by the fireplace. "You made acquaintance with my son, sir," said the old man in his chirping way, while he warmed his hands at the blaze. At his office, At his office, I expect. I nodded. Ha! I have heard that my son is a wonderful hand at his business, sir. I nodded hard. Yes, so they tell me. His business is the law. I nodded harder. Which makes it more surprising. In my son, said the old man. For he was not brought up to the law, but to the wine coopering. Curious to know how the old gentleman stood informed concerning the reputation of Mr. Jaggers, I roared that name at him. He threw me into the greatest confusion by laughing heartily and replying in a very sprightly manner, No, to be sure, you're right. And to this hour have not the faintest notion what he meant, or what joke he thought I had made. As I could not sit there nodding at him perpetually, without making some other attempt to interest him, I shouted at inquiry whether his own calling in life had been the wine coopering. By dint of straining that term out of myself several times and tapping the old gentleman on the chest to associate it with him, I at last succeeded in making my meaning understood. No, said the old gentleman, the warehousing first. Car? The warehousing first, over yonder. He appeared to mean up the chimney, but I believe he intended to refer me to Liverpool, and then in the city of London here. However, having an infirmity, for I am hard of hearing, sir, I expressed in pantomime the greatest astonishment. Yes, hard of hearing, having that infirmity coming upon me, my son, he went into the law, and he took charge of me, and he, by little and little, made out this elegant and beautiful property. But returning to what you said, pursued the old man. All right, But returning to what you said, pursued the old man, again laughing heartily. What I say is, no, to be sure, you're right. I was modestly wondering whether my utmost ingenuity would have enabled me to say anything that would have amused him half as much as this imaginary pleasantry, when I was startled by a sudden click in the wall on one side of the chimney, and the ghostly tumbling open of a little wooden flap with John upon it. The old man, following my eyes, cried with great triumph, My son's come home! And we both went out to the drawbridge. It was worth any money to see Wemmick waving a salute to me from the other side of the moat, when we might have shaken hands across it with the greatest ease. The aged was so delighted to work the drawbridge that I made no offer to assist him, but stood quiet until Wemmick had come across, and had presented me to Miss Skiffins, a lady by whom he was accompanied. Miss Skiffins was of a wooden appearance, and was, like her escort, in the post-office branch of the service. She might have been some 2 or 3 years younger than Wemmick, and I judged her to stand possessed of portable property. The cut of her dress from the waist upward, both before and behind, made her figure very like a boy's kite, and I might have pronounced her gown a little too decidedly orange, and her gloves a little too intensely green. But she seemed to be a good sort of fellow, and showed a high regard for the aged. I was not long in discovering that she was a frequent visitor at the castle, for, on our going in, and my complimenting Wemmick on his ingenious contrivance for announcing himself to the aged, he begged me to give my attention for a moment to the other side of the chimney, and disappeared. Presently another click came, and another little door tumbled open with Miss Skiffins on it. Then Miss Skiffins shut up and John tumbled open. Then Miss Skiffins and John both tumbled open together, and finally shut up together. On Wemmick's return from working these mechanical appliances, I expressed the great admiration with which I regarded them, and he said, "Well, you know, they're both pleasant and useful to the aged. And by George, sir, it's a thing worth mentioning that of all the people who come to this gate, the secret of those poles is only known to the aged, Miss Skiffins, and me." "And Mr. Wemmick made them," added Miss Skiffins, "with his own hands out of his own head." While Miss Skiffins was taking off her bonnet, she retained her green gloves during the evening as an outward and visible sign that there was company. Wemmick invited me to take a walk with him round the property, and see how the island looked in winter-time. Thinking that he did this to give me an opportunity of taking his Walworth sentiments, I seized the opportunity as soon as we were out of the castle. Having thought of the matter with care, I approached my subject as if I had never hinted at it before. I informed Wemmick that I was anxious in behalf of Herbert Pocket, and I told him how we had first met and how we had fought. I glanced at Herbert's home, and at his character, and at his having no means but such as he was dependent on his father for, those uncertain and unpunctual. I alluded to the advantages I had derived in my first rawness and ignorance from his society, and I confessed that I feared I had but ill repaid them, and that he might have done better without me in my expectations. Keeping Miss Havisham in the background at a great distance, I still hinted at the possibility of my having competed with him in his prospects, and at the certainty of his possessing a generous soul, and being far above any mean distrust, retaliations, or designs. For all these reasons, I told Wemmick, and because he was my young companion and friend, and I had a great affection for him, I wished my own good fortune to reflect some rays upon him, and therefore I sought advice from Wemmick's experience and knowledge of men and affairs, how I could best try with my resources to help Herbert to some present income, say, of 100 a year, to keep him in good hope and heart, and gradually to buy him on to some small partnership. I begged Wemmick, in conclusion, to understand that my help must always be rendered without Herbert's knowledge or suspicion, and that there was no one else in the world with whom I could advise. I wound up by laying my hand upon his shoulder and saying, "I can't help confiding in you, though I know it must be troublesome to you, but that is your fault in having ever brought me here." Wemmick was silent for a little while, and then said with a kind of start, "Well, you know, Mr. Pip, I must tell you one thing. This is devilish good of you." "Say you'll help me to be good then," said I. "Ecod!" replied Wemmick, shaking his head. "That's not my trade." "Nor is this your trading place," said I. "You are right," he returned. "You hit the nail on the head, Mr. Pip. I'll put on my considering cap, and I think all you want to do may be done by degrees. Skiffings, that's her brother, is an accountant, an agent. I'll look him up and go to work for you." "I thank you 10,000 times. On the contrary," said he, "I thank you, for though we are strictly in our private and personal capacity, still it may be mentioned that there are Newgate cobwebs about, and it brushes them away." After a little further conversation to the same effect, we returned into the castle, where we found Miss Skiffins preparing tea. The responsible duty of making the toast was delegated to the aged, and that excellent old gentleman was so intent upon it that he seemed to me in some danger of melting his eyes. It was no nominal meal that we were going to make, but a vigorous reality. The aged prepared such a haystack of buttered toast that I could scarcely see him over it as it simmered on an iron stand hooked on to the top bar. while Miss Skiffins brewed such a jorum of tea that the pig in the back premises became strongly excited and repeatedly expressed his desire to participate in the entertainment. The flag had been struck, and the gun had been fired at the right moment of time, and I felt as snugly cut off from the rest of Walworth as if the moat were 30 feet wide by as many deep. Nothing disturbed the tranquillity of the castle but the occasional tumbling open of John and Miss Skiffins, which little doors were a prey to some spasmodic infirmity that made me sympathetically uncomfortable until I got used to it. I inferred from the methodical nature of Miss Skiffin's arrangements that she made tea there every Sunday night, and I rather suspected that a classic brooch she wore, representing the profile of an undesirable female with a very straight nose and a very new moon, was a piece of portable property that had been given her by Wemmick. We ate the whole of the toast and drank tea in proportion, and it was delightful to see how warm and greasy we all got after it. The aged, especially, might have passed for some clean old chief of a savage tribe, just oiled. After a short pause of repose, Miss Skiffins, in the absence of the little servant who, it seemed, retired to the bosom of her family on Sunday afternoons, washed up the tea things in a trifling ladylike amateur manner that compromised none of us. Then she put on her gloves again, and we drew round the fire, and Wemmick said, Now, aged parent, tip us the paper." Wemmick explained to me while the aged got his spectacles out that this was according to custom, and that it gave the old gentleman infinite satisfaction to read the news aloud. "I won't offer an apology," said Wemmick, "for he isn't capable of many pleasures. Are you aged, P?" "All right, John." "Nope." "All right, John, all right," returned the old man, seeing himself spoken to. Only tip him a nod every now and then when he looks off his paper," said Wemmick, "and he'll be happy as a king." "And he'll be as happy as a king. We are all attention, aged one." "All right, John, all right," returned the cheerful old man, so busy and so pleased that it really was quite charming. The aged... that is so hard to say. The aged... so it's the aged apostrophe S. So I'm going to change that shit because it's really hard to say. His reading reminded me of the classes at Mr. Wopsel's great aunt's, with the pleasanter peculiarity. Oh my gosh, why am I struggling with this word? Peculiarity. I'm going to let my ears hear it. I've said it 1,000,000 times in this book.
Peculiarity.
Peculiarity. With the pleasanter peculiarity... Let's go. With the pleasanter peculiarity, there's no L at the end, Boston. Oh my gosh.
Peculiarity. Peculiarity.
Why am I struggling?
Peculiarity. 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 Let's just do it. With the pleasanter peculiarity that it seemed to come through a keyhole. Jesus Lord! Oh my gosh. All right. Sometimes it's just the
the order of words, syllabic way of it that messes you up. All right. As he wanted the candles close to him, and as he was always on the verge of putting either his head or the newspaper into them, he required as much watching as a powder mill. But Wemmick was equally untiring and gentle in his vigilance, and the aged read on, quite unconscious of his many rescues. Whenever he looked at us, we all expressed the greatest interest and amazement, and nodded until he resumed again. As Wemmick and Miss Skiffin sat side by side, and as I sat in a shadowy corner, I observed a slow and gradual elongation of Mr. Wemmick's mouth, powerfully suggestive of his slowly and gradually stealing his arm round Miss Skiffin. Powerfully suggestive of his slowly and gradually stealing his arm round Miss Skiffin's waist. In course of time, I saw his hand appear on the other side of Miss Skiffin's, but at that moment Miss Skiffins neatly stopped him with the green glove, unwound his arm again as if it were an article of dress, and with the greatest deliberation laid it on the table before her. Miss Skiffin's composure while she did this was one of the most remarkable sights I have ever seen, and if I could have thought the act consistent with abstraction of mind, I should have deemed that Miss Skiffins performed it mechanically. By and by, I noticed Wemmick's arm beginning to disappear again, and gradually fading out of view. Shortly afterwards, his mouth began to widen again. After an interval of suspense on my part that was quite enthralling and almost painful, I saw his hand appear on the other side of Miss Skiffin's. Instantly, Miss Skiffin stopped it with the neatness of a placid boxer, took off that girdle or cestus as before, and laid it on the table. Taking the table to represent the path of virtue, I am justified in stating that during the whole time of the aged's reading, Wemmick's arm was straying from the path of virtue and being recalled to it by Miss Skiffins. At last, the aged read himself into a light slumber. This was the time for Wemmick to produce a little kettle, a tray of glasses, and a black bottle with a porcelain-topped cork. Excuse me. Representing some clerical dignitary of a Rubicon. Is it Rubicon or Rubicon? I'm going to make sure. Well, I know Dickens owned a thesaurus. I can tell you that much.
Rubicon.
Representing some clerical dignitary of a rubicund and social aspect. With the aid of these appliances, we all had something warm to drink, including the aged, who was soon awake again. Miss Skiffins mixed, and I observed that she and Wemmick drank out of one glass. Of course, I knew better than to offer to see Miss Skiffins home, and under the circumstances, I thought I had best go first, which I did, taking a cordial leave of the aged, and having passed a pleasant evening. Before a week was out, I received a note from Wemmick, dated Walworth, stating that he had hoped he had made some advance in that matter appertaining to our private and personal capacities, and that he would be glad if I could come and see him again upon it. So, I went out to Walworth again, and yet again, and yet again, and I saw him by appointment in the city several times, but never held any communication with him on the subject, in or near Little Britain. The upshot was that we found a worthy young merchant or shipping broker, not long established in business, who wanted intelligent help, and who wanted capital, and who in due course of time and receipt would want a partner. Between him and me, secret articles were signed of which Herbert was the subject, and I paid him half of my £500 down. And engaged for sundry other payments, some to fall due at certain dates out of my income, some contingent on my coming into my property. Miss Skiffin's brother conducted the negotiation. Wemmick pervaded it throughout, but never appeared in it. The whole business was cleverly managed, that Herbert had not the least suspicion of my hand being in it. I never shall forget the radiant face with which he came home one afternoon and told me, as a mighty piece of news, of his having fallen in love with one Clarriker, the young merchant's name, and of Clarriker's having shown an extraordinary inclination towards him, and of his belief that the opening had come at last. Day by day, as his hopes grew stronger and his face brighter, he must have thought me a more and more affectionate friend, for I had the greatest difficulty in restraining my tears of triumph when I saw him so happy. At length, the thing being done, and he having that day entered Clarriker's house, and he having talked to me for a whole evening in a flush of pleasure and success, I did really cry in good earnest when I went to bed, to think that my expectations had done some good for somebody. A great event in my life, the turning point of my life, now opens on my view, but before I proceed to narrate it, and before I pass on to all the changes it involved, I must give one chapter to Estella. It is not much to give to the theme that so long filled my heart. I don't understand, dude. I really don't. Like, I get it. He's trying to do something nice and do it quietly like his benefactor is doing for him. But, like, you know, Joe should be the one, you know, the person that, you know, brought you up by hand, right? It's garbage. It's garbage. All right. So I'm probably going to leave off here. Maybe we'll do one more. It's possible we could do one more. Perhaps. All right, we'll do one more. We'll do the Estella chapter, and then we'll be on to whatever this is. The greatest event in his life, the turning point. So we'll get the Estella chapter out of the way, and then we'll do that. This is chapter 38 here. Right? Yeah. Chapter 38. Nope, hold on. Let's do this first, because I see a word that I need to check. I think it's stayed. I think it's stayed. Stayed?
Stayed.
Stayed. All right. Chapter 38. If that staid old house near the green at Richmond should ever come to be haunted when I am dead, it will be haunted, surely, by my ghost. Oh, the many, many nights and days through which the unquiet spirit within me haunted that house when Estella lived there. Let my body be where it would, my spirit was always wandering about that house. The lady with whom Estella was placed, Mrs. Brandley by name, was a widow with one daughter several years older than Estella. The mother looked young, and the daughter looked old. The mother's complexion was pink, and the daughter's was yellow. The mother set up for frivolity, and the daughter for theology. They were in what is called a good position, and visited, and were visited by, numbers of people. Little, if any, community of being subsisted between them and Estella, but the understanding was established that they were necessary to her, and that she was necessary to them. Mrs. Brandley had been a friend of Miss Havisham's before the time of her seclusion. In Mrs. Brandley's house, and out of Mrs. Brandley's house, I suffered every kind and degree of torture that Estella could cause me. I suffered every kind and degree of torture that Estella could cause me. My dogs are going to do this to me now. I suffered every kind and degree of torture that Estella could cause me. The nature of my relations with her, which placed me on terms of familiarity without placing me on terms of favor, conduced to my distraction. She made use of me to tease other admirers, and she turned the very familiarity between herself and me to the account of putting a constant slight on my devotion to her. If I had been her secretary, steward, half-brother, poor relation, if I had been a younger brother or her appointed husband, I could not have seemed to myself further from my hopes when I was nearest to her. The privilege of calling her by her name and hearing her call me by mine became, under the circumstances, an aggravation of my trials. And while I think it likely that it almost maddened her other lovers, I know too certainly that it almost maddened me. She had admirers without end. No doubt my jealousy made an admirer of every one who went near her, but there were more than enough of them without that. I saw her often at Richmond. I heard of her often in town, and I used often to take her and the Brandleys on the water. There were picnics. Picnics, really? There were picnics. Another word here. All right, so it's fete. Fete days, plays, operas, concerts, parties, all sorts of pleasures through which I pursued her, and they were all miseries to me. I never had 1 hour's happiness in her society, and yet my mind, all round the 24 hours, was harping on the happiness of having her with me into death. Throughout this part of our intercourse, and it lasted, as will presently be seen, for what I then thought a long time, she habitually reverted to that tone which expressed that our association was forced upon us. There were other times when she would come to a sudden check in this tone, and in all her many tones, and would seem to pity me. Pip, Pip, she said one evening, coming to such a check, when we sat apart at a darkening window of the house in Richmond. Will you never take warning? Of what? Of me. Warning not to be attracted by you, do you mean, Estella? Do I mean? If you don't know what I mean, you are blind. I should have replied that love was commonly reputed blind, but for the reason that I always was restrained, and this was not the least of my miseries, by a feeling that it was ungenerous to press myself upon her, when she knew that she could not choose but obey Miss Havisham. My dread always was that this knowledge on her part laid me under a heavy disadvantage with her pride, and made me the subject of a rebellious struggle in her bosom. At any rate, said I have no warning given me just now, for you wrote to me to come to you this time. That's true, said Estella, with a cold, careless smile that always chilled me. After looking at the twilight without for a little while, she went on to say, the time has come round when Miss Havisham wishes to have me for a day at Satis. The time has come round when Miss Havisham wishes to have me for a day at Satis. You are to take me there, and bring me back, if you will. She would rather I did not travel alone, and objects to receiving my objects, to receiving my maid, for she has a sensitive horror of being talked of by such people. One more time. For she has a sensitive horror of being talked of by such people. Can you take me? Can I take you, Estella? You can, then, the day after tomorrow, if you please. You are to pay all charges out of my purse. You hear the condition of your going. And must obey, said I. This was all the preparation I received for that visit, or for others like it. Miss Havisham never wrote to me, nor had I ever so much as seen her handwriting. Nor had I ever so much as seen her handwriting. We went down on the next day but one, and we found her in the room where I had first beheld her, and it is needless to add that there was no change in Satis house. And it is needless to add that there was no change in Satis house. She was even more dreadfully fond of Estella than she had been when I last saw them together. I repeat the word advisedly, for there was something positively dreadful in the energy of her looks and embraces. She hung upon Estella's beauty, hung upon her words, hung upon her gestures, and sat mumbling her own trembling fingers while she looked at her, as though she were devouring the beautiful creature she had reared. From Estella she looked at me, with a searching glance that seemed to pry into my heart and probe its wounds. "How does she use you, Pip? How does she use you?" she asked me again, with her witch-like eagerness, even in Estella's hearing. But when we sat by her flickering fire at night, she was most weird, for then, keeping Estella's hand drawn through her arm and clutched in her own hand, she extorted from her, by dint of referring back to what Estella had told her in her regular letters, the names and conditions of the men whom she had fascinated, and as Miss Havisham dwelt upon this role, with the intensity of a mind mortally hurt and diseased, she sat with her other hand on her crutch stick, and her chin on that, and her wan, bright eyes glaring at me, a very spectre. I saw in this, wretched though it made me, and bitter the sense of dependence and even of degradation that it awakened, I saw in this that Estella was set to wreak Miss Havisham's revenge on men, and that she was not to be given to me until she had gratified it for a term. I saw in this a reason for her being beforehand assigned to me, sending her out to attract and torment and do mischief. Miss Havisham sent her with the malicious assurance that she was beyond the reach of all admirers, and that all who staked upon that cast were secured to lose. I saw in this that I, too, was tormented by a perversion of ingenuity, even while the prize was reserved for me. I saw in this the reason for my being staved off so long, and the reason for my late guardian's declining to commit himself to the formal knowledge of such a scheme. In a word, I saw in this Miss Havisham, as I had her then and there before my eyes, and always had her before my eyes, and I saw in this the distinct shadow of the darkened and unhealthy house in which her life was hidden from the sun. The candles that lighted that room of hers were placed in sconces on the wall. They were high from the ground, and they burnt with the steady dullness of artificial light and air that is seldom renewed. As I looked round at them, and at the pale gloom they made, and at the stopped clock, and at the stopped clock, and at the withered articles of bridal dress upon the table and the ground, and at her own awful figure with its ghostly reflection thrown large by the fire upon the ceiling and the wall. I saw in everything the construction that my mind had come to, repeated, and thrown back to me. My thoughts passed into the great room across the landing where the table was spread, and I saw it written, as it were, in the falls of the cobwebs from the centerpiece, in the crawlings of the spiders on the cloth, in the tracks of the mice as they betook their little quickened hearts behind the panels, and in the gropings and pausings of the beetles on the floor. It happened on the occasion of this visit that some sharp words arose between Estella and Miss Havisham. It was the first time I had ever seen them opposed. We were seated by the fire, as just now described, and Miss Havisham still had Estella's arm drawn through her own, and still clutched Estella's hand in hers, when Estella gradually began to detach herself. She had shown a proud impatience more than once before, and had rather endured that fierce affection than accepted or returned it. "What?" said Miss Havisham, flashing her eyes upon her. "Are you tired of me?" "Only a little tired of myself," replied Estella, disengaging her arm and moving to the great chimney-piece, where she stood looking down at the fire. "Speak the truth, you ingrate!" cried Miss Havisham, passionately striking her stick upon the floor. "You are tired of me!" Estella looked at her with perfect composure, and again looked down at the fire. Her graceful figure and her beautiful face expressed a self-possessed indifference to the wild heat of the other that was almost cruel. "You stock and stone!" exclaimed Miss Havisham. "You cold, cold heart!" "What?" said Estella, preserving her attitude of indifference as she leaned against the great chimney-piece and only moving her eyes. "Do you reproach me for being cold? You?" "Are you not?" was the fierce retort. "You should know," said Estella. "I am what you have made me. Take all the praise. Take all the blame. Take all the success. Take all the failure. In short, take me." "Oh, look at her! Look at her!" cried Miss Havisham bitterly. "Look at her so hard and thankless, on the hearth where she was reared, where I took her into this wretched breast when it was first bleeding from its stabs, and where I have lavished years of tenderness upon her." "At least I was no party to the compact," said Estella, "for if I could walk and speak when it was made, it was as much as I could do. But what would you have? You have been very good to me, and I owe everything to you. What would you have?" "Love," replied the other. "You have it." "I have not," said Miss Havisham. "Mother by adoption," retorted Estella, never departing from the easy grace of her attitude, never raising her voice as the other did, never yielding either to anger or tenderness. "Mother by adoption. I have said that I owe everything to you. All I possess is freely yours. All that you have given me is at your command to have again. Beyond that, I have nothing. And if you ask me to give you what you never gave me, my gratitude and duty cannot do impossibilities." "Did I never give her love?" cried Miss Havisham, turning wildly to me. "Did I never give her a burning love, inseparable from jealousy at all times, and from sharp pain, while she speaks thus to me? Let her call me mad! Let her call me mad!" "Why should I call you mad?" returned Estella. "I, of all people, does anyone live who knows what set purposes you have, half as well as I do? Does anyone live who knows what a steady memory you have, half as well as I do? I, who have sat on this same hearth, on the little stool that is even now beside you there, learning your lessons and looking up into your face, when your face was strange and frightened me. Soon forgotten! Moaned, nope, that's a moan. Soon forgotten, moaned Miss Havisham. Time soon forgotten. No, not forgotten, retorted Estella. Not forgotten, but treasured up in my memory. When have you found me false for your teaching? When have you found me unmindful of your lessons? When have you found me given admission here? One more time. When have you found me giving admission here? She touched her bosom. She touched her bosom. I want to make sure. God dang it. Bosom. God dang it. She touched her bosom with her hand. To anything that you excluded, be just to me. So proud! So proud! Moaned Miss Havisham, pushing away her gray hair with both her hands. Who taught me to be proud? Returned Estella. Who praised me when I learnt my lesson? So hard, moaned Miss Havisham, with her former action. Who taught me to be hard? Returned Estella. Who praised me when I learnt my lesson? But to be proud and hard to me, Miss Havisham quite shrieked, as she stretched out her arms. Estella! 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 To be proud and hard to me! Estella looked at her for a moment with a kind of calm wonder, but was not otherwise disturbed. When the moment was past, she looked down at the fire again. I cannot think, said Estella, raising her eyes after a silence, why you should be so unreasonable when I come to see you after a separation. I have never forgotten your wrongs and their causes. I have never been unfaithful to you or your schooling. I have never shown any weakness that I can charge myself with. Would it be weakness to return my love? Exclaimed Miss Havisham. But yes, she would call it so. I begin to think, said Estella in a musing way, after another moment of calm wonder, that I almost understand how this comes about. If you had brought up your adopted daughter wholly in the dark confinement of these rooms, and had never let her know that there was such a thing as the daylight, by which she had never once seen your face, if you had done that, and then, for a purpose, had wanted her to understand the daylight and know all about it, you would have been disappointed and angry? Miss Havisham, with her head in her hands, sat making a low moaning and swaying herself on her chair, but gave no answer. Or, said Estella, which is a nearer case, if you had taught her, from the dawn of her intelligence, with your utmost energy and might, that there was such a thing as daylight, but that it was made to be her enemy and destroyer, and she must always turn against it, for it had blighted you and would else blight her. If you had done this, and then, for a purpose, had wanted her to take naturally to the daylight, and she could not do it, you would have been disappointed and angry? Miss Havisham sat listening, or it seemed so, for I could not see her face, but still made no answer. So, said Estella, I must be taken as I have been made. The success is not mine. The failure is not mine, but the two together make me. Miss Havisham had settled down, I hardly knew how, upon the floor, among the faded bridal relics with which it was strewn. I took advantage of the moment. I had sought one from the first, to leave the room, after beseeching Estella's attention to her with a movement of my hand. When I left, Estella was yet standing by the great chimney-piece, just as she had stood throughout, Miss Havisham's gray hair was all adrift upon the ground among the other bridal wrecks, and was a miserable sight to see. It was with a depressed heart that I walked in the starlight for an hour and more, about the courtyard, and about the brewery, and about the ruined garden. When I at last took courage to return to the room, I found Estella sitting at Miss Havisham's knee, taking up some stitches in one of those old articles of dress that were dropping to pieces, and of which I had often been reminded since by the faded tatters of old banners that I have seen hanging up in cathedrals. Afterwards, Estella and I played at cards, as of yore, only we were skillful now, and played French games, and so the evening wore away, and I went to bed. I lay in that separate building across the courtyard. I lay in that separate building across the courtyard. It was the first time I had ever lain down to rest in the saddest house, and sleep refused to come near me. 1,000 Miss Havishams haunted me. She was on this side of my pillow, on that, at the head of the bed, at the foot, behind the half-open door of the dressing room, in the dressing room, in the room overhead, in the room beneath, everywhere. At last, when the night was slow to creep on towards 2 o'clock, I felt that I absolutely could no longer bear the place as a place to lie down in, and that I must get up. I therefore got up and put on my clothes, and went out across the yard into the long stone passage, designing to gain the outer courtyard and walk there for the relief of my mind. But I was no sooner in the passage than I extinguished my candle, for I saw Miss Havisham going along it in a ghostly manner, making a low cry. I followed her at a distance and saw her go up the staircase. She carried a bare candle in her hand, which she had probably taken from one of the sconces in her own room, and was a most unearthly object by its light. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, I felt the mildewed air of the feast chamber, without seeing her open the door, and I heard her walking there, and so across into her own room. And so across into her own room, and so across again into that, never ceasing the low cry. After a time, I tried in the dark both to get out and to go back, but I could do neither until some streaks of day strayed in and showed me where to lay my hands. During the whole interval, whenever I went to the bottom of the staircase, I heard her footstep, saw her light pass above, and heard her ceaseless low cry. Before we left next day, there was no revival of the difference between her and Estella, nor was it ever revived on any similar occasion, and there were 4 similar occasions, to the best of my remembrance. Nor did Miss Havisham's manner towards Estella in any wise change, except that I believed it to have something like fear infused among its former characteristics. It is impossible to turn this leaf of my life without putting Bentley Drummle's name upon it, or I would, very gladly. On a certain occasion when the Finches were assembled in force, and when good feeling was being promoted in the usual manner by nobody's agreeing with anybody else, the presiding Finch called the Grove to order, for as much as Mr. Drummle had not yet toasted a lady, which according to the solemn constitution of the society, it was the brute's turn to do that day. I thought I saw him leer in an ugly way at me while the decanters were going round, but as there was no love lost between us, that might easily be. What was my indignant surprise when he called upon the company to pledge him to Estella. "Estella who?" said I. "Never you mind," retorted Drummle. "Estella of where?" said I. "You are bound to say of where," which he was, as a Finch. "Of Richmond, gentlemen," said Drummle, putting me out of the question, "and a peerless beauty." Much he knew about peerless beauties. A mean, miserable idiot, I whispered Herbert. "I know that lady, no. I know that lady, said Herbert across the table when the toast had been honored. Do you? Said Drummle. And so do I added with a scarlet face. Do you? Said Drummle. Oh, Lord! This was the only retort, except glass or crockery, that the heavy creature was capable of making. But I became as highly incensed by it as if it had been barbed with wit, and I immediately rose in my place and said that I could not but regard it as being like the Honorable Finch's impudence to come down to that grove. We always talked about coming down to that grove as a neat parliamentary turn of expression. Down to that grove, proposing a lady of whom he knew nothing. Mr. Drummle, upon this, starting up, demanded what I meant by that. Whereupon, I made him the extreme reply that I believed he knew where I was to be found. Whether it was possible in a Christian country to get on without blood after this was a question on which the Finches were divided. The debate upon it grew so lively indeed that at least 6 more honorable members told 6 more during the discussion that they believed they knew where they were to be found. However, it was decided at last, the grove being a court of honor, that if Mr. Drummle would bring never so slight a certificate from the lady, importing that he had the honor of her acquaintance, Mr. Pip must express his regret, as a gentleman and a Finch, for having betrayed into a warmth which. Next day was appointed for the production, lest our honor should take hold from delay, and next day Drummle appeared with a polite little avowal in Estella's hand, that she had had the honor of dancing with him several times. This left me no course but to regret that I had been betrayed into a warmth which, and on the whole to repudiate as untenable the idea that I was to be found anywhere. Drummle and I then sat snorting at one another for an hour, while the grove engaged in indiscriminate contradiction, and finally the promotion of good feeling was declared to have gone ahead at an amazing rate. I tell this lightly, but it was no light thing for me. For I cannot adequately express what pain it gave me to think that Estella should show any favor to a contemptible, clumsy, sulky booby, so very far below the average. To the present moment, I believe it to have been referable to some pure fire of generosity and disinterestedness in my love for her, that I could not endure the thought of her stooping to that hound. No doubt I should have been miserable whomsoever she had favored, but a worthier object would have caused me a different kind and degree of distress. It was easy for me to find out, and I did soon find out, that Drummle had begun to follow her closely, and that she allowed him to do it. A little while, and he was always in pursuit of her, and he and I crossed one another every day. He held on in a dull, persistent way, and Estella held him on, now with encouragement, now with discouragement, now almost flattering him, now openly despising him, now knowing him very well, now scarcely remembering who he was. The spider, as Mr. Jaggers had called him, was used to lying in wait, however, and had the patience of his tribe. Added to that, he had a blockhead confidence in his money and in his family greatness, which sometimes did him good service, almost taking the place of concentration and determined purpose. So, the spider, doggedly watching Estella, outwatched many brighter insects, and would often uncoil himself and drop at the right nick of time. At a certain assembly ball at Richmond, there used to be assembly balls at most places then, where Estella had outshone all other beauties, this blundering Drummle so hung about her, and with so much toleration on her part, that I resolved to speak to her concerning him. I took the next opportunity, which was when she was waiting for Mrs. Blandley to take her home and was sitting apart among some flowers, ready to go, I was with her, for I almost always accompanied them to and from such places. Are you tired, Estella? Rather, Pip. You should be. Say, rather, I should not be, for I have my letter to Satis House to write before I go to sleep. Recounting tonight's triumph, said I. Surely a very poor one, Estella. What do you mean? I didn't know there had been any. Estella, said I, do look at that fellow in the corner yonder. Who is looking over here at us? Why should I look at him? Returned Estella, with her eyes on me instead. What is there in that fellow in the corner yonder, to use your words, that I need to look at? Indeed, that is the very question I want to ask you, said I, for he has been hovering about you all night. Moths, and all sorts of ugly creatures, replied Estella with a glance towards him, hover about a lighted candle. Can the candle help it? No, I returned, but cannot the Estella help it? Well, said she, laughing after a moment, perhaps, yes, anything you like. But Estella, do hear me speak. It makes me wretched that you should encourage a man so generally despised as Drummle. You know he is despised. Well, said she, you know he is as ungainly within as without, a deficient, ill-tempered, lowering, stupid fellow. Well, said she, you know he has nothing to recommend him but money and a ridiculous roll of addle-headed You know he has nothing to recommend him but money and a ridiculous roll of addle-headed predecessors. Now, don't you? Well, said she again, and each time she said it she opened her lovely eyes the wider. To overcome the difficulty of... God dang it, man. Now, all right. To overcome the difficulty of getting past that monosyllable, I took it from her and said, repeating it with emphasis, well, then that is why it makes me wretched. Now, if I could have believed that she favored Drummle with any idea of making me, wretched, I should have been in better heart about it. But in that habitual way of hers, she put me so entirely out of the question that I could believe nothing of the kind. Pip, said Estella, casting her glance over the room, don't be foolish about its effect on you. It may have its effect on others. It may be meant to have. It's not worth discussing. Yes, it is, said I, because I cannot bear that people should say she throws away her graces and attractions on a mere bore, the lowest in the crowd. I can bear it, said Estella. Oh, don't be so proud, Estella, and so inflexible. Calls me proud and inflexible in this breath, said Estella, opening her hands, and in his last breath reproached me for stooping to a bore. There is no doubt you do, said I, something hurriedly, for I have seen you give him looks and smiles this very night, such as you never give to me. Do you want me, then? Said Estella, turning suddenly with a fixed and serious, if not angry look, to deceive and entrap you? Do you deceive and entrap him, Estella? Yes, and many others, all of them but you. Here is Mrs. Blandley. I'll say no more. And now that I have given the one chapter to the theme that so filled my heart, and so often made it ache and ache again, I pass on unhindered to the event that to the event that had impended over me longer yet, the event that had begun to be prepared for, before I knew that the world held Estella, and in the days when her baby intelligence was receiving its first distortions from Miss Havisham's wasting hands. In the Eastern story, the heavy slab that was to fall on the bed of state in the flush of conquest was slowly wrought out of the quarry. The tunnel for the rope to hold it in its place was slowly carried through the leagues of rock. The slab was slowly raised and fitted in the rope. The rope was rove to it and slowly taken through the miles of hollow to the great iron ring, all being made ready with much labor, and the hour come. The Sultan was aroused in the dead of the night, and the sharpened axe that was to sever the rope from the great iron ring was put into his hand, and he struck with it, and the rope parted and rushed away, and the ceiling fell. So in my case, all the work, near and afar, that tended to the end had been accomplished, and in an instant the blow was struck, and the roof of my stronghold dropped upon me. Wow, what a frickin' paragraph, dude. Like, how dare you end a paragraph with that, end the chapter with that kind of paragraph. That's not cool. It's not cool. Because I'm done. I'm not reading anymore. That's 2 hours of reading. But I don't want to leave off there. So we're probably going to have to read more tomorrow, for sure. The next chapter is quite lengthy as well. So, you know what? We're going to read this chapter because this is the end of part 2. We're going to read this chapter because it does say at the end of it, it's the end of part 2. So it makes sense to do that. Yeah, we should do it. All right. I'm tired. I don't want to read more because I'm making mistakes, but this is, after this next chapter, will be the best place to leave off today. So here we go. Chapter 39. I was 23 years of age. Not another word had I heard to enlighten me on the subject of my expectations, and my 23rd birthday was a week gone. We had left Bernard's Inn more than a year, and lived in the Temple. Our chambers were in Garden Court, down by the river. Mr. Pocket and I had for some time parted company as to our original relations, though we continued on the best terms. Notwithstanding my inability to settle to anything, which I hope arose out of the restless and incomplete tenure on which I held my means, I had a taste for reading, and read regularly so many hours a day. That matter of Herbert's was still progressing, and everything with me was as I have brought it down to the close of the last preceding chapter. Business had taken Herbert on a journey to Marseilles. I think it's Marseille. Marseille, I'm pretty sure. Marcellus? How do we pronounce Marseille? Marseille.
In French, Marseille, 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 or in Occitan, Marseille,
Business had taken Herbert on a journey to Marseille. I was alone, and had a dull sense of being alone, dispirited and anxious, long hoping that tomorrow or next week would clear my way, and long disappointed. I sadly missed the cheerful face and ready response of my friend. It was wretched weather, stormy and wet, and mud, deep in all the streets. Day after day, a vast heavy veil had been driving over London from the east, and it drove still, as if in the east there was an eternity of cloud and wind. So furious had been the gusts that high buildings in town had had the lead stripped off their roofs, and in the country trees had been torn up, and sails of windmills carried away, and gloomy accounts had come in from the coast of shipwreck and death. Violent blasts of rain had accompanied these rages of wind, and the day just closed as I sat down to read had been the worst of all. I'm going to say that one again. and the day just closed as I sat down to read had been the worst of all. Alterations have been made in that part of the temple since that time, and it has not now so lonely a character as it had then, nor is it so exposed to the river. We lived at the top of the last house, and the wind rushing up the river shook the house that night, like discharges of cannon or breakings of a sea. When the rain came with it and dashed against the windows, I thought, raising my eyes to them as they rocked, that I might have fancied myself in a storm-beaten lighthouse. Occasionally, the smoke came rolling down the chimney as though it could not bear to go out into such a night, and when I set the doors open and looked down the staircase lamps were blown out, and when I shaded my face with my hands and looked through the back windows, black windows, opening them ever so little was out of the question in the teeth of such wind and rain, I saw that the lamps in the court were blown out, and that the lamps on the bridges and the shore were shuddering, and that the coal fires and barges on the river were being carried away before the wind like red-hot splashes in the rain. I read with my watch upon the table, purposing to close my book at 11 o'clock. As I shut it, St. Paul's and all the many church clocks in the city, some leading, some accompanying, some following, struck that hour. The sound was curiously flawed by the wind, and I was listening and thinking how the wind assailed it and tore it when I heard a footstep on the stair. What nervous folly made me start, and awfully connected with the footstep of my dead sister, matters not. It was past in a moment, and I listened again, and heard the footsteps stumble in, coming on. Remembering then that the staircase lights were blown out, I took up my reading lamp and went out to the stairhead. Whoever was below had stopped on seeing my lamp, for all was quiet. "There is someone down there, is there not?" I called out, looking down. "Yes," said a voice from the darkness beneath. "What floor do you want?" "The top, Mr. Pip." "That is my name. There is nothing the matter." "Nothing the matter," returned the voice, and the man came on. I stood with my lamp held out over the stair rail, and he came slowly within its light. It was a shaded lamp to shine upon a book, and its circle of light was very contracted, so that he was in it for a mere instant, and then out of it. "What's up, Chris? Welcome in, man." "Hope you're doing well tonight, Chris. Thanks for checking out the stream." In the instant, I had seen a face that was strange to me, looking up with an incomprehensible air of being touched and pleased by the sight of me. Moving the lamp as the man moved, I made out that he was substantially dressed, but roughly, like a voyager by sea, that he had long, iron-gray hair, that his age was about 60, that he was a muscular man, strong on his legs, and that he was browned and hardened by exposure to weather. As he ascended the last stair or two, and the light of my lamp included us both, I saw, with a stupid kind of amazement, that he was holding out both his hands to me. "Pray, what is your business?" I asked him. My business," he repeated, pausing. "Ah, yes, I will explain my business by your leave." "Do you wish to come in?" "Yes," he replied. "I wish to come in, master." I had asked him the question inhospitably enough, for I resented the sort of bright and gratified recognition that still shone in his face. I resented it because it seemed to imply that he expected me to respond to it. But I took him into the room I had just left, and having set the lamp on the table, asked him as civilly as I could to explain himself. He looked about him with the strangest air, an air of wondering pleasure, as if he had some part in the things he admired, and he pulled off a rough outer coat and his hat. Then I saw that his head was furrowed and bald, and that the long iron-gray hair grew only on its sides, but I saw nothing that in the least explained him. On the contrary, I saw him next moment, once more holding out both his hands to me. "What do you mean?" said I, half suspecting him to be mad. He stopped in his looking at me, and slowly rubbed his right hand over his head. "It's disappointing to a man," he said, in a coarse, broken voice, "arter having looked for'ard so distant, and come so fur. But you're not to blame for that. Neither on us is to blame for that. I'll speak in half a minute. Give me half a minute, please." He sat down on a chair that stood before the fire and covered his forehead with his large, brown, veinous hands. I looked at him attentively then and recoiled a little from him, but I did not know him. "There's no one nigh," said he, looking over his shoulder. "Is there?" There's a car outside, guys. Give me a second. I think my wife or son is going somewhere. So, Chris, if you're still there, man, how you doing tonight, bro? It's good to see you. It is good, man. It is good. Oh, my God. She's just going to warm up the car while I'm sitting here reading. She could have waited. She could have waited. So, quite a ways to go on this one. Oh, they have Double D tonight. They have D&D. That's where they're going. They're going to D&D. Hopefully soon.
Not here for long, just popping in quickly.
Ecto, I appreciate the 23 months, man. Thank you so much, dude. Much love. Hope you're doing well tonight, bro. 23 frickin' months, tier 1. You're a legend, bro. Thank you so much for the sub. 23 months, almost 2 years. So you're due a new badge soon. That's pretty badass. Hope you and Lozzie are okay. I hope you guys are hanging in there. Who's Jimenez? I'm not sure who Jimenez is. Jimenez. We're getting there slowly. Hopefully quiet Christmas this year. We were starting to get worried it would be another expensive one, but doing a Secret Santa style thing this year. Okay, good. Yeah, I hate Christmas. It's always so stressful approaching December. I understand. My family and I stopped doing Christmas many, many, many years ago. All right, I think the car is still idling out there, but I think it might be quiet enough now. Perhaps. My family was never big on Christmas growing up, but somehow last 3 years we have gone rather big. Do you guys have kids? Because usually Christmas is for the children. It would be a little weird to not be big on Christmas and then all of a sudden, like, adult family is into Christmas. That's the weird part. No kids or grandkids. Yeah, that is a little unusual. Yeah. When my wife and I got together, 8 years ago, she had 3 kids and I had 3 kids, and we essentially decided to, instead of having holidays, instead of celebrating holidays, we would treat every day like it was a holiday. So, like, we would buy gifts for each other and the kids or whatever on just random days. Like, if we saw something that one of the children would like, we would just get it. We wouldn't, like, squirrel it away for Christmas or something like that. You know what I mean? And then, like, when the Easters and stuff like that would pop around, then none of that really mattered. You know? Because they were getting spoiled on other days of the year, days that didn't matter. So, like, all days became the same for our family. And it's worked out really quite well over the years. And now all of our kids are adults, and they, some of them, not all of them, some of them have kind of stuck to that. But, I mean, to be fair, it's much cheaper that way, much more inexpensive to just put it out over the whole year. All of these holidays, they are only invented for economy boost. That's all it is. It's to boost the economy. It's a ploy to get your money away from you. My grandmother loved Christmas and passed Waya about hat time. I'm not sure what that is. That must be a local thing. I think my mother wanted to do more Christmas stuff in memory of her, and that makes sense. That does make sense. Sentimental reasons. And that's right. My wife just said it's more meaningful. We do eat extra food on traditional holidays. That's true. So, like, we will do that. Like, we'll plan special meals on holidays sometimes. You know, like Thanksgiving, we sat down to a meal with the family with half a turkey, half a ham. And then we'll save the other half of the turkey and the ham for Christmas. But other than that, and that's more to... I think that's more to appease my mom as well, really, because she's more traditional when it comes to these holidays also. So, yes? How much longer till you guys leave?
We're probably going to.
Because I'm waiting to continue my reading.
Okay.
Yeah. I can't do it with the passport idling out there. Sounding like it frickin' has been smoking for 40 years.
Spencer's. Wait, no, this was
Oh, in Longview. It's nice. Let me see the back.
There's no back.
Well, there is a back. I just want to see it. All right.
It's just the butterfly.
Jesse, you going to D&D tonight? But yeah, that's what all of those holidays are meant for. How much?
$44.
Wow, that's kind of expensive.
Yeah, but I need an expensive jacket.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. Let's see. Christmas will be celebrated when our out-of-town family comes to visit. The food is very important to Nana, and it's just because of, and it's the same reason as Ecto's talking about. It's all sentimentality. It reminds her of times past. And I'll keep it real. Like, for me, I was in the same family as her. So, like, it definitely reminds me of those times as well. But for me, those times aren't as positive as they are for her. They weren't as a positive experience for me as they are for her. So it doesn't matter to me either way. If we do it, fine. If we don't, whatever. It's how she connects to family and remembers the ones gone. That's right. And that's the same reason why I don't really care to do it. Because the same people that she wants to remember, I want to forget. I know that sounds heartless, but it is what it is. I mean, there are some good people up there. There's not many. I mean, within my own family, especially my mom's side of the family, there's not a whole lot of good people up there. I'm going to keep it real. You know what I mean? And, like, I mean, my Aunt Kathy is passable. I don't know. But, like, I feel like the people that I really connected to are already gone. And the people that I didn't, there's a lot of people that I didn't connect to, or that I wanted to connect to, that failed me, that are already gone. We need toy missiles and toy frogs so we can hang mistletoes for Christmas. Let's go. Okay, I think they're gone. And I didn't hear them drive away. So that's... We're going to get back into the book. I'm about halfway through this chapter. So here we go. No, I hear people out there. I'm hoping someday that I can get not only insulation in this room, but I would love to get soundproofing in here as well. Just so we don't have to pause like this. Yeah, they're still here. All right. Guys, don't forget we still have 9 uses of our Black Friday Streamloots code available. It's 20% off your Streamloots purchase. And the code word is winter. You can go to streamloots.com/The Boston Chris Show to support me as a full-time content creator and get a nice little chunk of change off of your purchase. That code is only good until the end of November, and then it goes away forever. So get you some. All right, here we go. Why do you, a stranger coming into my room, ask at this time of night, ask that question? Said I. You're the game one, he returned, shaking his head at me with a deliberate affection, at once most unintelligible and most exasperating. I'm glad you've grown up, a game one, but don't catch hold of me. You'd be sorry afterwards to have done it. I relinquished the intention he had detected, for I knew him. Even yet I could not recall a single feature, but I knew him. If the wind and the rain had driven away the intervening years, had scattered all the intervening objects, had swept us to the churchyard where we first stood, face to face, on such different levels, I could not have known my convict more distinctly than I knew him now as he sat in the chair before the fire. No need to take a file from his pocket and show it to me. No need to take the handkerchief from his neck and twist it round his head. No need to hug himself with both his arms and take a shivering turn across the room, looking back at me for recognition. I knew him before he gave me one of those aids, though a moment before I had not been conscious of remotely suspecting his identity. He came back to where I stood and again held out both his hands, not knowing what to do, for in my astonishment I had lost my self-possession. I reluctantly gave him my hands. He grasped them heartily, raised them to his lips, kissed them, and still held them. You acted noble, my boy, said he. Noble, Pip, and I have never forgotten it. Noble, Pip, and I have never forgot it. At a change in his manner, as if he were even going to embrace me, I laid a hand upon his breast and put him away. Damn it. I laid a hand upon his breast and put him away. Stay, said I. Keep off. If you are grateful to me for what I did when I was a little child, I hope you have shown your gratitude by mending your way of life. If you have come here to thank me, it was not necessary. Still, however you have found me out, there must be something good in the feeling that has brought you here, and I will not repulse you. But surely you must understand that my attention was so attracted by the singularity of his fixed look at me that the words died away on my tongue. You was a-sayin', he observed, when we had confronted one another in silence, that surely I must understand. What? Surely must I understand? That I could not wish to renew that chance intercourse with you of long ago, under these different circumstances. I am glad to believe you have repented and recovered yourself. I am glad to tell you so. I am glad that, thinking I deserve to be thanked, you have come to thank me. But our ways are different ways nonetheless. You are wet, and you look weary. Will you drink something before you go? He had placed his neckerchief loosely, and had stood, keenly observant of me, biting a long end of it. I think, he answered, still with the end at his mouth and still observant of me, that I will drink. I thank you, afore I go. There was a tray ready on a side table. I brought it to the table near the fire and asked him what he would have. He touched one of the bottles without looking at it or speaking, and I made him some hot rum and water. I tried to keep my hands steady while I did so, but his look at me as he leaned back in his chair with the long draggled end of his neckerchief between his teeth, evidently forgotten, made my hand very difficult to master. When at last I put the glass to him, I saw with amazement that his eyes were full of tears. Up to this time I had remained standing, not to disguise that I wished him gone, but I was softened by the softened aspect of the man, and felt a touch of reproach. "I hope," said I, hurriedly putting something into a glass for myself, and drawing a chair to the table, "that you will not think I spoke harshly to you just now. I had no intention of doing it, and I am sorry for it if I did. I wish you well and happy." As I put my glass to my lips, he glanced with surprise at the end of his neckerchief, dropping from his mouth when he opened it, and stretched out his hand. I gave him mine, and then he drank, and drew his sleeve across his eyes and forehead. "How are you living?" I asked him. "I've been a sheep farmer, stock breeder, other trades besides, away in the New World," said he. "Many 1,000 mile of stormy water off from this." "I hope you have done well." "I've done wonderfully well. There's others went out a longer me as has done well too, but no man has done nigh as well as me. I'm famous for it." "I'm glad to hear it." "I hope to hear you say so, my boy." Without stopping to try to understand those words or the tone in which they were spoken, I turned off to a point that had just come into my mind. "Have you ever seen a messenger you once sent to me," I inquired, "since he undertook that trust?" "Never set eyes upon him. I warn't likely to it." All right, guys, so just so we're clear, the whole book is making sense now to me. This is obviously his benefactor, right? It has to be, because everything makes sense now. So the book wants you to believe, the author of the book wants you to believe that Miss Havisham, who is clearly of some means and is clearly in association with Mr. Jaggers in some way, is the benefactress. But I don't think so, because if that were the case, there is no reason for her to tell Mr. Jaggers that it's against the rules for Pip to discuss the identity of his benefactor, right? And then Mr. Jaggers makes a ambivalent response to a question earlier tonight, where Pip wants to know when he's gonna know who his benefactor is. When is the time of my being told, right? And Mr. Jaggers can't tell him. Mr. Jaggers doesn't know when. And I'm going to tell you why I don't think he knows when. I think they don't know when because they're waiting for the convict to get out of prison. Or the convict got out of prison and he's off in the New World, right? So he's currently unavailable to Mr. Jaggers. That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking maybe this convict that Pip helped out when he was a kid either was really rich and then was sent to prison, or whatever sent him to prison made him really rich, or like there was like maybe he stole a bunch of money and Mr. Jaggers has access to that money and is essentially giving an allowance from that, right? We'll see if I'm right. I could be completely off base here, but we'll find out. Let's continue. "He came faithfully, and he brought me the 2 1-pound notes. I was a poor boy then, as you know, and to a poor boy they were a little fortune. But like you, I have done well since, and you must let me pay them back. You can put them to some other poor boy's use." I took out my purse. He watched me as I laid my purse upon the table and opened it, and he watched me as I separated 2 1-pound notes from its contents. They were clean and new, and I spread them out and handed them over to him. Still watching me, he laid them one upon the other, folded them longwise, gave them a twist, set fire to them at the lamp, and dropped the ashes into the tray. "May I make May I make so bold," he said then, with a smile that was like a frown, and with a frown that was like a smile, "as ask you how you have done well, since you and me was out on them lone shivering marshes. How? Ah! He emptied his glass, got up, and stood at the side of the fire, with his heavy brown hand on the mantel shelf. He put a foot up to the bars to dry and warm it, and the wet boot began to steam. But he neither looked at it nor at the fire, but steadily looked at me. It was only now that I began to tremble. When my lips had parted, and it had shaped some words that were without sound, I forced myself to tell him, though I could not do it distinctly, that I had been chosen to succeed to some property. "Might a mere warmint ask what property?" said he. I faltered. "I don't know." "Might a mere warmint ask whose property?" said he. I faltered again. "I don't know." "Could I make a guess, I wonder," said the convict, "at your income since you come of age, as to the first figure now, 5? With my heart beating like a heavy hammer of disordered action, I rose out of my chair and stood with my hand upon the back of it, looking wildly at him. "Concerning a guardian," he went on. "There ought to have been some guardian or such like, whiles you was a minor, some lawyer, maybe. As to the first letter of that lawyer's name now, would it be J?" All the truth of my position came flashing on me, and its disappointments, dangers, disgraces, consequences of all kinds rushed in such a multitude that I was borne down by them and had to struggle for every breath I drew. "Put it," he resumed, "as the employer of that lawyer whose name begun with a J, and might be Jaggers. Put it as he had come oversea to Portsmouth, and had landed there, and had wanted to come on to you. However, you have found me out, you says just now. Well, however, did I find you out? Why, I wrote from Portsmouth to a person in London for particulars of your address. That person's name? Why, Wemmick." I could not have spoken one word, though it had been to save my life. I stood, with a hand on the chair back and a hand on my breast, where I seemed to be suffocating. I stood so, looking wildly at him, until I grasped at the chair. When the room began to surge and turn, he caught me, drew me to the sofa, put me up against the cushions, and bent on one knee before me, bringing the face that I now well remembered, and that I shuddered at, very near to mine. "Yes, Pip, dear boy, I've made a gentleman of you. It's me what has done it. I swore that time, sure as ever I earned a guinea, that guinea should go to you. I swore arterwards, sure as I ever speculated and got rich, you should get rich. I lived rough, that you should live smooth. I worked hard, that you should be above work. What odds, dear boy, do I tell it for you to feel an obligation? Not a bit. I tell it for you to know as that they're hunting. No, one more time. For you to know as that there hunted dunghill dog what you kept life in, got his head so high that he could make a gentleman, and Pip, you're him. The abhorrence in which I held the man. The abhorrence of... No, one more time. Get into the frickin' scene. The abhorrence, and then a car goes by. The abhorrence in which I held the man, the dread I had of him, the repugnance with which I shrank from him, could not have been exceeded if he had been some terrible beast. Look-ye here, Pip. I'm your second father. You're my son, more to me nor any son. I've put away money only for you to spend. When I was a hired-out shepherd in a solitary hut, not seeing no faces but faces of sheep till I half forgot what men's and women's faces was like, I see yourn. I drops my knife many a time in that hut when I was a-eatin' my dinner or my supper, and I says, here's the boy again, a-looking at me whiles I eats and drinks. I see you there a many times, as plain as ever I see you on them misty marshes. Lord, strike me dead, I says each time. And I goes out in the air to say it under the open heavens. But what? If I gets liberty and money, I'll make that boy a gentleman. And I done it. Why, look at you, dear boy. Look at these here lodgings of yourn, fit for a lord. A lord! Ah! You shall show money with lords for wagers and beat 'em. In his heat and triumph, and in his knowledge that I had been nearly fainting, he did not remark on my reception of all this. It was the one grain of relief I had. Looky here, he went on, taking my watch out of my pocket and turning towards him a ring on my finger, while I recoiled from his touch as if he had been a snake. A golden and a beauty. That's a gentleman's, I hope. A diamond all set round with rubies. That's a gentleman's, I hope. Look at your linen, fine and beautiful. Look at your clothes, better ain't to be got, and your books too. Turning his eyes round the room, mounting up on their shelves by hundreds, and you read 'em, don't you? I seed you'd been a read of 'em. No. I see you'd been a reading of 'em when I come in. Ha 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 ha! You shall read 'em to me, dear boy. And if they're in foreign languages what I don't understand, I shall be just as proud as if I did. Again he took both my hands and put them to his lips, while my blood ran cold within me. Don't you mind talking, Pip, said he, after again drawing his sleeve over his eyes and forehead, as the click came in his throat, which I well remembered, and he was all the more horrible to me that he was so much in earnest. You can't do better nor keep quiet, dear boy. You ain't looked slowly forward to this as I have. You wasn't prepared for this as I was. But didn't you never think it might be me? Oh, no, I returned. Never. Well, you see it was me. And single-handed. Never a soul in it but my own self and Mr. Jaggers. Was there no one else? I asked. No, said he with a glance of surprise. Who else should there be? And dear boy, how good-looking you have growed. There's bright eyes somewheres, eh? Isn't there bright eyes somewheres, what you love the thoughts on? Oh, Estella. They shall be yourn, dear boy, if money can buy 'em. Not that a gentleman like you, so well set up as you, can't win 'em off of his own game, but money shall back you. Let me finish what I was telling you, dear boy. From that there hut and that there hiring out, I got money left me by my master, which died and had been the same as me, and got my liberty and went for myself. And every single thing I went for you. Lord, strike a blight upon it, I says. Whatever it was I went for, if it ain't for him. It all prospered wonderful. As I give you to understand just now, I am famous for it. It was the money left me, and the gains of the first few year what I sent home to Mr. Jaggers, all for you, when he first come arter you, agreeable to my letter. Oh, that he had never come, that he had left me at the forge, far from contented, yet by comparison happy. And then, dear boy, it was a recompense to me. Recompense. I'm going to check that one.
Recompense.
And then, dear boy, it was a recompense to me, looky here, to know in secret that I was making a gentleman. The blood horses of them colonists might fling up the dust over me as I was walking. What do I say? I says to myself, I'm making a better gentleman nor ever you'll be, when one of 'em says to another, he was a convict a few year ago, and is a... He was a convict a few year ago, and is an ignorant common fellow now, for all he's lucky. What do I say? I says to myself, if I ain't a gentleman, nor yet ain't got no learning, I'm the owner of such. All on you own stock and land, which on you owns a brought-up London gentleman. This way I kept myself a-going, and this way I held steady afore my mind that I would for certain come one day and see my boy, and make myself known to him on his own ground. He laid his hand on my shoulder. I shuddered at the thought that for anything I knew, his hand might be stained with blood. It warn't easy, Pip, for me to leave them parts, nor yet it weren't safe. But I held to it, and the harder it was, the stronger I held, for I was determined, and my mind firm and made up. At last I done it. Dear boy, I done it! I tried to collect my thoughts, but I was stunned. Throughout, I had seemed to myself to attend more to the wind and the rain than to him. Even now, I could not separate his voice from those voices, though those were loud and his was silent. Where will you put me? He asked presently. I must be put somewheres, dear boy. To sleep? Said I. Yes, and to sleep long and sound, he answered, for I've been sea-tossed and sea-washed months and months. My friend and companion, said I, rising from the sofa, is absent. You must have his room. He won't come back tomorrow, will he? No, said I, answering almost mechanically, in spite of my utmost efforts. Not tomorrow. Because, looky here, dear boy, he said, dropping his voice and laying a long finger on my breast in an impressive manner. Caution is necessary. How do you mean, caution? It's death. What's death? I was sent for life. It's death to come back. There's been overmuch coming back of late years, and I should of a certainty be hanged if took. Nothing was needed but this. The wretched man, after loading wretched me with his gold and silver chains for years, had risked his life to come to me, and I held it there in my keeping. If I had loved him instead of abhorring him, if I had been attracted to him by the strongest admiration and affection, instead of shrinking from him with the strongest repugnance, it could have been no worse. On the contrary, it would have been better, for his preservation would then have naturally and tenderly addressed my heart. My first care was to close the shutters, so that no light might be seen from without, and then to close and make fast the doors. While I did so, he stood at the table drinking rum and eating biscuit, and when I saw him thus engaged, I saw my convict on the marshes at his meal again. It almost seemed to me as if he must stoop down presently to file at his leg. When I had gone into Herbert's room and had shut off any other communication between it and the staircase than through the room in which our conversation had been held, I asked him if he would go to bed. He said yes, but asked me for some of my gentleman's linen to put on in the morning. I brought it out and laid it ready for him, and my blood again ran cold when he again took me by both hands to give me good night. I got away from him, without knowing how I did it, and mended the fire in the room where we had been together, and sat down by it, afraid to go to bed. For an hour or more I remained too stunned to think, and it was not until I began to think that I began fully to know how wrecked I was, and how the ship in which I had sailed was gone to pieces. Miss Havisham's intentions towards me, all a mere dream. Estella, not designed for me. I only suffered in Satis House as a convenience, a sting for the greedy relations, a model with a mechanical heart to practice on when no other practice was at hand. Those were the first smarts I had. But sharpest and deepest pain of all, it was for the convict, guilty of I knew not what crimes, and liable to be taken out of those rooms where I sat thinking, and hanged at the Old Bailey door, that I had deserted Joe. I would not have gone back to Joe now. I would not have gone back to Biddy now, for any consideration. Simply, I suppose, because my sense of my own worthless conduct to them was greater than every consideration. No wisdom on earth could have given me the comfort that I should have derived from their simplicity and fidelity, but I could never, never undo what I had done. In every rage of wind and rush of rain, I heard pursuers. Twice I could have sworn there was a knocking and whispering at the outer door. With these fears upon me, I began either to imagine or recall that I had had mysterious warnings of this man's approach, that, for weeks gone by, I had passed faces in the streets which I had thought like his, that these likenesses had grown more numerous as he, coming over the sea, had drawn nearer, that his wicked spirit had somehow sent these messengers to mine, and that now on this stormy night he was as good as his word, and with me. Crowding up with these reflections came the reflection that I had seen him with my childish eyes to be a desperately violent man, that I had heard that other convict reiterate that he had tried to murder him, that I had seen him down in the ditch tearing and fighting like a wild beast. Out of such remembrances I brought into the light of the fire a half-formed terror that it might not be safe to be shut up there with him in the dead of the wild solitary night. This dilated until it filled the room, and impelled me to take a candle and go in and look at my dreadful burden. He had rolled a handkerchief round his head, and his face was set and lowering in his sleep. Sorry, guys, car. But he was asleep, and quietly, too, though he had a pistol lying on the pillow. Assured of this, I softly removed the key to the outside of his door and turned it on him before I again sat down by the fire. Gradually, I slipped from the chair and lay on the floor. When I awoke without having parted in my sleep with the perception of my wretchedness, the clocks of the eastward churches were striking 5. The candles were wasted out. The fire was dead, and the wind and rain intensified the thick black darkness. This is the end of the second stage of Pip's expectations. All right, so I have been for a while renumerating that it wasn't Miss Havisham, right? Miss Havisham being the benefactor made sense at first when I thought this was all about Estella, right? But nobody was talking about Estella except for Miss Havisham. Mr. Jaggers wasn't, right? Wemmick wasn't. None of them were talking about were talking about Estella. Neither was Mr. Pocket. Neither was Herbert. None of them were talking about her. And I would have thought it didn't add up that Estella, was not part of the conditions that Mr. Jaggers was giving to Pip when he gave him his expectations. It would have seemed to me that it would have been a very simple thing to add to the conditions, right? You're not allowed to know who your benefactor is, and so you have to also be chained to Estella, right? So then my logical mind has started to say, well, at the same time, if Estella was a condition of the expectations, then that would give away the identity of the benefactor, and that is strictly not allowed to be talked about, right? That's the condition. Not allowed to talk about who your benefactor is. So at that point in time, it wasn't Havisham to me anymore. I was like, okay, it's not Havisham. So then I got to thinking that perhaps Joe was the benefactor for a short time because of the dynamic with his sister being hurt, right? Because her accident or her attack, whatever, occurred right around the same time as the expectations being put upon Pip. So I started thinking, well, maybe it's Joe, out of some kind of guilt. Like maybe Joe snapped and attacked Pip's sister, and it was out of some kind of guilt that he was somehow rich secretly, and now he's just going to give his inheritance to Pip secretly because he was worried about getting arrested. But then that didn't make any sense to me either, because I mean, Pip's going to be inheriting anything from Joe anyway, right? So, like, if Joe is secretly rich and his sister dies, it's going to Pip. So that didn't make sense to me either. When Mr. Jaggers started talking about, when Pip and Mr. Jaggers started talking about the timing of when Pip is going to know who his benefactor was, because Pip was assuming that once he became of age, he would be told who his benefactor was. So he was excited about that. And so when that wasn't the case, he wanted to know when. And Mr. Jaggers was very flimsy on when. And then I was like, okay, wait a minute. Mr. Jaggers is literally like balls deep in fucking criminals all the time. Like every freaking chapter, every time he goes down to Little Britain, there's all of these people standing in line and hovering around trying to get Mr. Jaggers' attention. Like he's a mover and shaker. And I was like, okay, wait a minute. So I was like, I betcha it's the damn convict from the beginning of the book that Pip didn't turn in or didn't turn in. That was the benefactor. And then sure enough, boom, there you go. That's why I said it like right there before we found out for sure. Killer story. We are through 39 chapters now. We have 20 more to read. Part 3 of the book will be started in my next live stream. Make sure you are following. If you're watching on TikTok, I am The Boston Chris Show on Twitch and YouTube and on Kick. I don't know if you guys have those platforms. If you do, you should definitely follow me there. If you are on Twitch and YouTube tonight, thank you guys for watching and following along, or just white noising me if that's what you did. Appreciate y'all. I have to thank Ectoplastastic once again for the 23-month resubbery, which makes him an absolute legend of a human being. So yeah, I'll see you guys soon. I think I'm going to be streaming some Ark tomorrow on Twitch and Kick. So